In the dusty heart of the frontier, where the wind whispers of forgotten battles and the ground is stained with the blood of lost souls, there's a man who's lived through hell and walked out of it with his soul intact. Boone Lane, Anaby, outlaw with a reputation so dark even the moon shies away from him, wasn't looking for redemption. He wasn't looking for anyone at all. But when a broken girl, barefoot and bruised, caught his eye outside of Jasper's trading post, something inside him stirred. She had nothing, no name, no home, no hope, just a spirit that wouldn't break, a spirit he recognized too well. Boone didn't save her. He claimed her. This isn't a story of pity. It's a story of survival, of fire that never dies, and of a man who thought he was beyond saving. Will Boone's past finally catch up with him? Or will he fight with everything he has to protect the one thing he never thought he'd care about? If you're ready for a tale of love, redemption, and the price of claiming someone as your own, hit that like button, share it with those who crave the Wild West, and don't forget to subscribe for more epic stories. Boone Lane had never been one to look twice at a broken thing. He had seen enough of the world's ruin, the crumbled lives, the men and women with too many scars to count, the endless dust and death that followed every step. His own hands had dripped with enough blood to fill rivers, and his conscience had long since buried itself under the weight of his past sins. He wasn't in the business of saving anyone. That was until he saw her. It was just after noon when Boone rode into Jasper's trading post, the sun high and merciless above the horizon, a dust cloud swirling in his wake. His horse's hooves clattered against the dirt road, the sound echoing in the silent town. The saloon doors creaked in the breeze as men inside eyed him with the kind of wary respect reserved for those with a price on their head. His name was spoken in whispers, a curse in the mouths of good men, a warning in the ears of bad ones. But Boone wasn't looking for trouble, not today. He didn't need to. Trouble always found him. He dismounted, tied his horse to the post, and took a long, slow look around the place. The town wasn't much, a couple of run-down buildings, a handful of folks with faces as worn as the leather on their boots. But it was quiet, and Boone appreciated that. He wasn't here for anything more than to get supplies, food, whiskey, maybe a woman's company if the price was right. But then his eyes landed on her. She was sitting in the mud outside the trading post, her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped around them like she was trying to hold herself together. Her head was down, but Boone could see the way her shoulders trembled. The dirt clung to her dress, a pale thing torn at the hem, like it had once been white, but had long since lost the fight against the grime of the world. Her hair, wild and untamed, was held together by a frayed ribbon that seemed as out of place as she did. She was barefoot. Her lip was split, her skin pale from more than just the heat. She looked like she'd been living on scraps if she was, living at all. The men who passed by her didn't even spare her a glance, just another broken woman who'd found her way to the end of a long road, but Boone noticed her. He saw the way her eyes flicked toward him as he stepped closer, not out of fear, but something else, something he couldn't quite place. It was like she was sizing him up, measuring him the same way a predator watches its prey. She wasn't. Afraid, for a second, Boone felt something twist in his chest. It wasn't pity. He didn't do pity. But it was something he hadn't felt in a long time. He could have ignored her, could have walked right past and let the world keep turning as it always did. But he didn't. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She didn't ask for help. She didn't plead. She just looked up at him, her eyes empty of hope, but full of something else, something wild, like the world had tried to break her, and somehow she had fought back. Boone reached down, gripped her arm, and lifted her to her feet. Her body was light, fragile, like a bird caught in a storm. She didn't flinch at his touch, but her eyes, those eyes, burned into him. "She's with me now," he said, his voice low, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was a claim. The men who had been watching didn't protest. They never did when Boone spoke like that. They saw the danger in his eyes, the promise of violence in his voice. And they saw her, too, the stray. No one said a word. No one needed to. Boone turned and walked toward the barn at the back of the post, the girl stumbling behind him. Her bare feet left prints in the dirt, but she didn't say a word, didn't ask where they were going, didn't even look back. He didn't know why he did it, why he picked her up like that, why he felt a strange pull to protect someone who had nothing and probably never would. He was an outlaw, a killer. His past was full of things he'd never speak of, and yet here he was, carrying a stranger toward a future he wasn't sure he could promise. But when you see someone like her, someone who has already been broken and still stands, something inside you shifts. Boone didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just another stray. This girl, with her fire and her wounds, was going to change everything, and neither of them was ready for what would come next. Boone didn't ask her name at first. He didn't ask her about her past or where she'd come from, and he certainly didn't ask why she'd ended up sitting in the dirt like a broken doll, left to rot by a world that didn't care. He didn't care. Not really. His world had never been kind. The men he rode with were nothing more than ghosts of violence and old regrets, the kind of men whose faces would be forgotten, but whose deeds would stain the land for generations. He wasn't about to let some young woman's sob story change that. But as the hours passed and they rode into the wilderness away from the town, Boone found it hard to ignore the gnawing feeling in his chest. The girl, Lily, as she'd finally told him, didn't speak much. Not at first. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring ahead as they made their way across the dry land, the sound of hooves the only thing breaking the silence between them. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows over the earth, but she didn't seem to notice. She didn't seem to care about anything at all. Boone, on the other hand, was restless. The weight of the past sat heavy on his shoulders, but there was something else now. A weight he couldn't explain. She was a burden, yes, a complication, definitely. But when he glanced over at her, sitting quietly on his horse beside him, he saw something that made his heart skip just a beat. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't trembling. In fact, there was something in the way she held herself that reminded him of, well, him. Her shoulders were squared, her jaw set, and her eyes, though still weary, held a quiet defiance. She was a survivor, like him, and for the first time in a long while, Boone felt like he wasn't alone in the world. By the time they reached his cabin, a small, weathered structure hidden in a stand of pine trees, the night had fully descended. The firelight flickered through the small window, casting a warm glow onto the ground outside. Boone dismounted and reached for her hand to help her down. She hesitated for a moment, then let him pull her down gently. As they walked inside, she finally spoke. "Where are we?" Boone paused, setting down his saddlebag. He looked at her, his face unreadable. "Home," he said simply. "For now?" It wasn't much. The cabin was sparse, built more for survival than comfort, but it had everything they needed: a stove, a cot, a table, and a few shelves of dried meat and herbs. There was a rifle above the door, and Boone's hat hung on a hook by the window. She stepped further into the cabin, her eyes scanning the small space. She seemed unimpressed. No surprise there. Boone wasn't exactly in the business of impressing people. She finally spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "I'm not some charity case, you know." Boone turned to her, his brow furrowing. "I didn't say you were." But he knew what she meant. He wasn't helping her because he had some sense of duty. He wasn't saving her. She was just another stray he'd found. And yet something in the pit of his stomach told him this was different. Lily didn't look at him as she moved toward the fire, her back straight as she bent to warm her hands. "I don't need your pity," she added. "I can take care of myself." Boone smirked, leaning back against the doorframe. I didn't offer it. There was a pause as they both stood there, her back to him, the fire crackling between them. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly, her words almost lost in the sound of the flames. Boone's smirk faded as he met her gaze. He didn't have a real answer, not one that made sense. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe because I see something in you." She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken understanding. Boone turned away, reaching for the kettle on the stove. "You're safe here, for now. And if you want to stay that way, you'll follow my rules." Lily raised an eyebrow, turning. "To face him? Rules?" she asked. "Stay out of my way. Don't try to run. And if you want to eat, there's work to do." The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Boone could see she was considering his words, weighing the reality of what was happening. She had no place to go, and in a strange way. Neither did he. "I don't need your protection," she said again, but there was a flicker of something else behind her eyes. Something like curiosity, maybe even a little hope. Boone didn't respond. He didn't have to. She'd see, soon enough. The world wasn't kind, and no one could survive alone out here. Not for long. As the night wore on, the firelight danced. On the walls, and for the first time in years, Boone felt something stir inside him. It wasn't hope. It wasn't kindness. It was something else. Something dangerous. He couldn't protect her forever, but he'd be damned if he let anyone else try. The next morning came with a quiet urgency. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the cabin's walls, casting soft rays of orange and gold across the wooden floor. Boone woke early, as he always did. The world never slowed down, for a man like him, and neither did the land. There was always something to be done. Lily, on the other hand, slept like the dead. Her exhaustion had caught up with her after the long ride, and she lay on the small cot Boone had made up for her breath steady and deep. Boone had made sure she was comfortable, or as comfortable as she could be, but there was no doubt in his mind that she'd never been in a place like this before. He didn't have the luxury of giving her peace, and she didn't have the luxury of ignoring the world around her. She'd have to learn how to survive here, in this place. And she'd have to do it fast. Boone stepped outside to find the world, still damp with the remnants of the night's cold, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. His boots crunched against the ground as he walked to the back of the cabin, where he had a small collection of traps set. He worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced ease as he reset the snares and checked the traps for anything worth taking. The day was already heating up, the sun creeping higher in the sky. He could feel the weight of it on his shoulders, the relentless pressure of survival. It had always been like this for him, one step after the other, never knowing if he'd see the next dawn. The land had a way of testing a man's limits, and Boone had long since passed the point of breaking. Lily, he noticed, had not stirred yet. He couldn't decide whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. She was tough, he could tell, but there was a difference between surviving and thriving. She didn't look like the kind of woman who could go a full day without food or water. Boone had learned that lesson the hard way, and he wasn't about to let her die out here, even if he didn't owe her anything. By the time he finished with the traps, Lily had woken. He could hear the sound of her moving around inside the cabin, the soft rustle of sheets as she stretched. Boone took his time, lighting a small fire outside to boil water for coffee, but he couldn't ignore the growing sense that something needed to change. She had to pull her weight, or she'd become a liability. As he stepped inside, he found her sitting at the table, her back straight and her eyes focused. She hadn't made a sound when he entered, but she had sensed him there. All the same, that was something else Boone noticed about her. She was sharp, maybe too sharp for her own good. "I found some rabbits in the traps," Boone said, his voice gruff. "We'll eat good today. If you want something to eat, you'll have to earn it." Lily looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Earn it? I didn't come here to be your servant." Boone leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "I didn't say you had to serve me. I said you have to earn your keep." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Fine. What do you want me to do?" Boone took a slow breath, considering. "We'll need firewood for the stove, and the rabbits need cleaning. After that, you can help me with the fences. The land's got its own way of testing you, Lily. If you can't keep up, I'll leave you in the dust. You got that?" For a moment Lily didn't respond. She didn't argue, didn't resist. She simply stood up, her movements steady and purposeful. "I got it," she said, a hint of steel in her voice. Boone watched as she moved toward the pile of firewood by the stove, picking up an axe. She wasn't weak. She might not have been a soldier or a trapper. But there was something in the way she held herself that made Boone realize she wasn't as fragile as she looked. As she chopped firewood, Boone set to work on the rabbits. The smell of meat filled the cabin, and though it wasn't a feast, it was enough to satisfy them for the day. Boone worked quickly, his hands moving with skill, born of years of practice. He glanced over at Lily now and then, watching her chop wood with an intensity he hadn't expected. She wasn't doing it gracefully, but she was doing it. By the time the sun had reached its peak in the sky, the cabin was filled with the smell of cooking meat, and Boone was feeling the heat of the day in his bones. The weight of survival had never been so tangible, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. Later, after they had eaten, Boone took her out to the fences. The work was hard, but Lily didn't complain. She just worked, her hands moving with determination as she helped him mend the broken posts and fix the wire. By the time the sun began to dip low in the sky again, they had made enough progress to keep the horses safe for another few days. As they stood at the fence, looking out over the land they'd just worked on, Boone felt something stir inside him. It was a strange feeling, like something long buried, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. It was hope, but hope was a dangerous thing out here, and Boone knew better than to let it take root. "Not bad," he said gruffly, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You're not as useless as I thought." Lily didn't smile, but the edge of her lips twitched just slightly. She was proud. And Boone, in his own twisted way, was too. But Boone wasn't the kind to linger on good moments. There was still work to be done, still danger lurking on the horizon. And he wasn't about to let it catch up with him. Not now. Not when something had finally started to change between them. Boone didn't need anyone. He'd learned that lesson long ago. But the world wasn't asking him anymore. It was telling him, and there was no turning back now. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land as Boone sat on the porch, his rifle resting across his knees. The cabin was quiet, save for the faint rustle of the wind through the trees and the crackling of the fire inside. He hadn't expected to find any peace here, hadn't expected to find anything at all, yet there it was. The strange, unsettling feeling of something close to comfort. Boone was used to solitude. It had been his companion for as long as he could remember. His past was a long trail of blood, betrayal, and unspoken regrets. Things he'd never talk about. He'd learned to live with the silence, to keep his thoughts locked away where no one could reach them. But lately, something had changed. It had started with her, the girl he'd pulled from the dust outside of Jasper's trading post. Her name was Lily, and she was tougher than she looked. It didn't take long for Boone to realize that she wasn't just another victim of the frontier. She was a fighter. She had survived the kind of things that most people couldn't even imagine. And now she was here, with him, in the middle of nowhere. Boone had tried to keep his distance, tried to keep his focus on the things that mattered, the land, the work, the survival. But it wasn't that simple anymore. Lily wasn't just some stray he'd found along the way. She had a fire in her, something that reminded him of himself. It was that fire that had kept her alive. But it was also the same fire that could burn them both down to nothing. He heard the door creak open behind him. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Lily had been a quiet presence in his life since the moment he'd found her, and that silence had started to settle between them like a second skin. "Boone," she said, her voice soft but steady. He didn't answer right away, just continued staring out at the horizon. The wind was picking up again, and the sky had turned a dull gray, the clouds heavy with the promise of rain. Boone didn't care about the storm. It wasn't the weather that troubled him. "What is it?" he finally asked, his voice gruff. Lily stepped onto the porch, standing a few feet away from him. She was carrying a small bundle of herbs she'd picked earlier, her hands busy with the task of sorting through them. Boone had noticed the way she moved, the way she handled herself. She wasn't scared anymore. She was learning to survive, and in a way, that made her more dangerous than anyone he'd ever met. "I need to know more about you," she said, her gaze steady on the herbs in her hands. "Why did you come out here? What's your story?" Boone stiffened, his grip tightening on the rifle. He hadn't expected this, not from her. He'd kept his past buried for a reason. He didn't want anyone knowing who he was or what he'd done. But Lily wasn't asking for pity. She was asking for the truth. He exhaled slowly, trying to calm the anger that had started to bubble up. He didn't want to talk about the past, didn't want to drag it into the present. But Lily had a way of pushing, of making him feel like he owed her something. "I'm not the man you think I am," Boone said, his voice low. "I came out here because it's the only place I could hide. You don't need to know why." Lily didn't back down. "You're hiding from something, Boone, from someone, and you don't get to pretend it's not important." He felt a jolt of irritation flare up in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "I've done things that don't go away just because I bury myself in the dirt. I don't want you to get mixed up in that. It's better for you if you just leave it alone." Lily turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "Is that what you tell yourself every night, that you don't have to deal with your past? You think you can just bury it and move on?" Boone's eyes flashed, his jaw clenched. "I don't need anyone's help with my demons. You'd be better off staying away from them." For a moment there was silence. The wind howled in the distance, and the fire crackled inside the cabin. Lily didn't back down, though. She stood there, staring at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter, but no less determined. "I'm not leaving. I'm not running from anything. And if you think I'm going to let you push me away just because it's easier for you, you're wrong." Boone didn't say anything at first. The truth of her words hit him harder than he'd expected. He had pushed people away his whole life, people who tried to get close, who tried to care. But every time, he'd burned them. Every time, he'd watched them walk away, and he'd let them. It was easier that way. But now there was something different, something that felt like it could break him if he wasn't careful. Lily took a step closer to him, her eyes softening. "I know you're running from something. I don't know what it is, but I'm not afraid of it." Boone met her gaze, his own hardened eyes narrowing. He could see the resolve in her, the same stubbornness that had kept her alive out here. And for a moment he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He forced the thought aside. Hope was dangerous, and Boone knew better than to let it take root. He had learned that lesson the hard way. "I don't want you here because of some sense of duty," Boone said, his voice raw, with something he couldn't quite explain. "You think I'm doing you a favor? I'm not. I'm just trying to survive." Little gaze didn't waver. "I don't need you to do me a favor. I need you to stop pretending like you're not human." Boone looked away, unable to hold her gaze any longer. His past was too much, too many mistakes, too many people left behind. He couldn't let her in, not now, not ever. But something in his chest tightened at her words, something that felt like a warning. He couldn't keep pushing her away, not if she was going to keep fighting for him. And for the first time in a long time, Boone felt like he might not be the only one on this trail anymore. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Boone finally stood up, grabbing his rifle and slinging it over his shoulder. "Get some rest," he muttered. "Tomorrow we keep moving." Lily didn't argue. She just nodded and turned back toward the cabin, her figure disappearing into the shadows. Boone stood there a moment longer, his hand resting on the rifle's stock. He wasn't sure what was happening between them, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep running forever, and neither could she. The storm arrived just after midnight. Boone had been sitting on the porch, his back leaning against the weathered wood, when the first gust of wind hit him. It wasn't a typical storm, the kind you could hear coming for miles, the kind that gave you time to prepare. No, this storm came like a whisper, quiet at first, then sudden. It rushed over the land, its fury gathering in the darkness, bringing with it a chill that cut through the air like a knife. Boone had been in storms before. He knew what they could do, how they could tear apart a man's world in the blink of an eye. But this storm wasn't just about the weather. It was something more, something that had been building for days. Lily had been restless. Boone could tell. She hadn't said much, but there was something in the way she carried herself, something in the way she looked at him. He wasn't sure if it was fear or curiosity, but he knew it wasn't just the storm on the horizon that had her on edge. It was him. It was his past. Boone wasn't the kind of man who talked about himself. He didn't share stories or give explanations. He didn't offer apologies or explanations. The past was the past, and that was the only way to survive. But Lily wasn't going to let it go. He could feel it in the way she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. And no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, he knew she was right. She wasn't afraid to ask questions, and sooner or later she'd push him to answer. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. Boone rose from his seat, his boots crunching on the ground, as he moved toward the cabin. Inside, Lily was sitting by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look up when he entered. She hadn't spoken much since the conversation earlier in the day, and Boone knew she was waiting for him to make the next move. He didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to go down that road. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the one building between them. "You should get some rest," Boone said, his voice gruff as he moved past her. He didn't meet her eyes. He couldn't. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Lily didn't respond right away, but Boone felt her eyes on him, burning through the back of his skull. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "I want to know why you're out here, Boone," she said, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. "I want to know what you're running from." Boone froze, his back stiffening at the sound of her voice. He hadn't expected her to bring it up now, not with the storm raging outside, not with everything else hanging between them, but there it was, as if she'd been waiting for him to say something. Boone turned to face her, his jaw clenched. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, the frustration building. He didn't want to talk about it. Didn't want to tell her what kind of man he really was. "I told you before," Boone said, his voice low and sharp. "It's none of your business." Lily's gaze didn't waver. She didn't flinch at his tone, didn't back down. "Then why do you keep pretending like it's not?" Boone took a step forward, his eyes flashing with anger. He was used to people pushing him, used to them wanting to know what made him tick. But Lily wasn't like the others. She didn't care about the lies he'd told. She wanted the truth, and that scared him more than anything else. "I'm not running from anything," Boone said, his voice low, dangerous. "I'm just trying to survive." Lily's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing. "That's the thing, Boone. You're not just surviving. You're hiding." Boone took a deep breath, trying to control the anger that was bubbling up inside him. He could feel it clawing at the back of his throat, but he kept his composure. He had to. He couldn't let her see how close he was to breaking. The wind howled outside, louder now, a steady roar in the distance. The storm was getting closer, and the air inside the cabin seemed to grow thick with tension. Boone could feel it, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He took a step back, his hand resting on the rifle by the door. You don't know what you're asking, Lily. You don't know what kind of man I am? Lily stood slowly, her eyes never leaving his. I don't need to know who you were. I just need to know who you are now. Boone didn't say anything. He couldn't. He wasn't the man he used to be, but he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The line between the past and the present had become so blurry that he didn't know where one ended and the other began. The storm outside seemed to mirror the chaos inside. The wind screamed through the trees, rattling the walls of the cabin, shaking the windows. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room, but there was no warmth in it. "Tell me," Lily said, her voice softening but still firm. "Tell me what you're running from. I can't help you if I don't know." Boone felt his breath catch in his throat, and for a moment he considered telling her everything. The bloodshed, the betrayals, the things he'd done that he could never undo. He thought about the faces of the men he'd killed, the faces of the ones who had tried to kill him. He thought about the promises he'd broken and the people he'd left behind. But the truth was a dangerous thing, and Boone wasn't sure he could survive it. "I'm not running from anything," Boone finally said, his voice a low growl. "I'm just trying to keep us alive." Lily didn't say anything for a long time. She didn't press him for answers, didn't push him any further. But Boone could see the disappointment in her eyes, the quiet understanding that he wasn't ready to share his demons. And for the first time in a long time, he hated himself for it. The storm outside had reached its peak, the wind howling in a fury that rattled the cabin's frame. Boone could feel the pressure of it all, the storm, the past, the weight of the lies he'd carried. And for a brief moment, he wondered if it was all about to come crashing down around him. But Lily was still there. She was still standing in front of him, not giving up, not backing down. And Boone realized something then, something he hadn't admitted to himself. He wasn't the only one fighting to survive. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one who had a past worth running from. The days that followed felt like a slow, inevitable march toward something Boone wasn't ready for. The calm that had settled in the wake of the storm was fragile, like a glass vase perched on the edge of a table, just waiting for the slightest nudge to send it crashing to the floor. The world outside the cabin was still, the silence of the wilderness stretching as far as Boone could see. But inside, something was changing, something Boone couldn't ignore, no matter how hard he tried. Lily had settled into life at the cabin, her hands growing stronger with each day as she worked alongside him. The firewood she chopped was stacked high, enough to last through the colder months. She had learned how to tend to the horses, how to patch up the roof, how to set the traps. Her movements had become more sure, more confident, but there was something else in her now, too. Something Boone couldn't quite name. The two of them worked together side by side, but there was a distance between them that neither seemed able to cross. Boone wasn't sure if it was the past, the one he had buried deep in the dark corners of his mind, or the future, the uncertainty of what was coming that kept them apart. He told himself that it didn't matter, that he was just here to survive, just here to keep moving. But the truth was something he couldn't shake. Lily was starting to get under his skin. Every time he looked at her, something twisted inside him. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't like any woman he had ever known. There was a fire in her, something raw and unrelenting that reminded him too much of himself. It scared him, more than he cared to admit. He wasn't supposed to care about her. He wasn't supposed to care about anyone. But Lily was starting to change that. It was late in the afternoon when Boone first saw the riders on the horizon. He'd been sitting outside the cabin, sharpening his knife, when he noticed the dust rising in the distance. At first, it was just a small speck, barely visible against the backdrop of the rolling hills. But as the riders grew closer, the hairs on the back of Boone's neck stood up. He wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting trouble. The past had a way of catching up to him, no matter how far he tried to run. Lily was inside the cabin, tending to the fire. Boone stood slowly, wiping the sharpening stone against his jeans as he scanned the horizon. The riders were still a good distance away, but Boone's instincts told him that they weren't just passing through. They were coming for him. He took a breath, steadying himself before walking to the door. "Lily," he called, his voice low but sharp. She appeared in the doorway a moment later, her eyes narrowing as she saw the tension in his posture. She knew something was wrong. Boone could see it in the way she held herself, in the way her eyes searched his face for the truth. "What is it?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with concern. "There's trouble coming," Boone said, his voice flat. "I need you to stay inside." Lily didn't argue. She didn't question him. She just nodded and stepped back into the cabin, disappearing behind the door. Boone moved quickly, pulling his rifle from the cabin and checking it over. His fingers moved with practiced ease, making sure it was ready. He didn't know who these riders were or what they wanted, but he had a good guess. It was always the same. The past had a way of finding him, and when it did, it brought nothing but pain. The riders were getting closer now, their figures becoming more distinct against the backdrop of the hills. Boone's hand tightened around the rifle, his gaze fixed on the approaching men. He didn't know how many there were. Maybe 3, maybe 4. They weren't moving fast, but they weren't wasting time either. Boone's eyes flicked to the cabin, the door still closed behind him. He wasn't sure if Lily was watching, but he knew she was listening. She had to be. He didn't want her to see what was coming. He didn't want her to be caught up in it. But the truth was, she was already involved. They both were. Boone had made a promise to keep her safe. But that promise had never felt heavier than it did now. The riders finally reached the cabin just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Boone stood in the doorway, his rifle aimed low but steady, his eyes never leaving the men. There were 3 of them, just as Boone had thought. They were riding hard, their horses coated in a layer of dust from the long ride, their faces grim and set in determination. Boone didn't recognize them, but that didn't mean they weren't trouble. Trouble had a way of finding him no matter where he went. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, pulled his horse to a stop in front of the cabin. The other 2 men flanked him, their eyes scanning the surroundings, as if they were expecting something more. Boone didn't flinch. He didn't move. "What do you want?" Boone asked, his voice cold and controlled. The leader eyed him, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. "We're looking for someone," he said, his voice low and rough. "A man named Boone Lane." Boone didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "I'm him." The leader's lips curled into a grin, but it wasn't a friendly one. "We've got a score to settle." Boone's fingers tightened on the rifle. He had been waiting for this. He had been waiting for someone to come after him, to drag him back to the life he had left behind. But that didn't mean he was ready for it. "I'm not going back," Boone said flatly. The leader's grin widened. "You don't get to choose, Boone. You're coming with us, whether you like it or not." Boone didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew what had to be done. The men were too close now. They weren't going to leave without a fight. And Boone wasn't about to let them take him. Not now. Not after everything he'd fought for. Not after he had finally found something worth protecting. He raised the rifle, the barrel steady in his hands, and aimed it at the leader's chest. The other 2 men reached for their guns, but Boone was faster. He fired first, the shot ringing, out into the air, echoing through the empty land. The leader fell from his horse, his body crumpling to the ground in a heap. The other 2 men hesitated, their eyes wide in shock. Boone didn't give them time to think. He fired again, hitting one of them in the shoulder. The man screamed, falling backward off his horse, his gun flying from his hand. The 3rd man froze, his hand still hovering over his gun. He was younger than the others, his face pale with fear. Boone's eyes locked on him, and for a moment everything seemed to slow down. The young man looked at Boone, his eyes pleading. "Please, don't—" Boone didn't hesitate. He fired. Once more the shot finding its mark. The man dropped to the ground, his body lifeless before it even hit the dirt. The silence that followed was deafening. Boone stood in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest, the smell of gunpowder heavy in the air. He didn't feel relief. He didn't feel victory. He just felt the weight of it all. He had done what he had to do. He had kept himself and Lily safe, but at what cost? The moon hung low over the land, casting long shadows across the dirt trail as Boone stood in the doorway, the weight of the last few minutes pressing heavily on his shoulders. His rifle, still warm from the shots he'd fired, hung loosely in. His hands. The men were dead, their bodies already cooling in the dirt, their horses tied to the nearby post. Boone could feel the presence of death hanging in the air, thick and undeniable. It had always followed him, but tonight it felt like it was suffocating him. His eyes scanned the scene, his breath steady but his chest tight. He wasn't surprised by what had happened. He had known this day would come eventually, the day when his past would finally catch up with him, but that didn't make it any easier. It didn't make the sting of it any less. Lily stood behind him, her figure a shadow. In the doorway, Boone could feel her gaze on him, but he didn't turn to face her. She had seen what he was capable of, what he had done, and he wasn't sure if she could understand it. She had come here looking for something, for safety, for survival, and now she had seen the kind of man Boone really was. He wasn't sure if she would stay. He wasn't sure if he wanted her to stay. "You killed them." Lily's voice cut through the silence, her words hanging heavy in the air. Boone didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The truth was right there, in front of them both. "I had no choice," he said, his voice flat, his back still turned toward her. "They would have killed us both." "I know," she replied, her voice soft but steady. I didn't think you'd do it like that." Boone turned then, meeting her gaze for the first time since the gunfire had stopped. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something he couldn't name. Shock, fear, maybe even a little anger. She had expected him to protect her, but she hadn't expected him to take lives in the process. "You think I wanted to do this?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think I wanted to pull that trigger? I'm not a hero, Lily. I'm a man who's been running from the past for too long. And now it's here, and it's not going to stop. Not unless I stop it first." Lily didn't say anything for a long moment. She stood in the doorway, her eyes fixed on him, but her posture was different now. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived at the cabin just days ago. She had seen Boone for what he was, and there was no turning back from that. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something softer now. "I'm here. I'm not running." Boone's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected her to stand beside him after everything that had happened. But she was still here, still standing in front of him, her eyes unwavering. "I'm not asking you to," Boone said, his voice softer now, the edge of anger, dulled by exhaustion. "I'm not asking you to fight my battles. You don't owe me anything." Lily took a step closer to him, her hand reaching out. But she didn't touch him. "Not yet. You don't get to push me away, Boone," she said, her voice firm. "You don't get to tell me that I can't help you. I'm not leaving. I'm not afraid of you." Boone's chest tightened, and for a moment he wondered if he would crack, if he would let himself feel something for her, something real, something dangerous. "Then you don't know me very well," he said quietly, his eyes searching hers. She held his gaze, her eyes steady and unyielding. "I know enough." The night dragged on, the silence stretching out between them like an endless desert. Boone didn't know how to fill the void. He didn't know how to make it right again. He had killed 3 men in cold blood, and now he had to deal with the consequences. It wasn't just the bodies on the ground outside. It was the weight of everything that had come before. The lies, the violence, the choices he had made. And now he was dragging Lily into it. She didn't deserve that. She had come here for safety, for a chance to escape her own past. She hadn't asked for any of this, but Boone wasn't sure he could give her the safety she wanted. He wasn't sure there was any safety to be found in this world. The next morning, Boone woke early, the dim light of dawn creeping through the cracks in the cabin. He could hear Lily moving around inside, her soft footsteps on the wooden floor. She had already begun the morning chores, stacking firewood by the door, preparing for the day ahead. Boone stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from his limbs, and made his way to the door. The world outside was still and quiet, the only sound the distant calls of birds and the whisper of the wind through the trees. But Boone knew that peace wouldn't last. He could feel it in his bones. There was more to come. He wasn't sure what that more was. But he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Lily was standing by the stove when he entered, her back to him. She was quiet this morning, more reserved than usual. Boone couldn't tell if it was because of the events from the night before or if something else was bothering her. But he wasn't sure how to fix it. "We need to go," Boone said, his voice low. "We can't stay here." Lily turned to face him, her eyes steady but guarded. "Where are we going?" "I don't know," Boone replied honestly. "But we need to move. Those men won't be the last ones to come looking for me. If we stay here, we'll be trapped." Lily didn't argue. She didn't ask any questions. She just nodded, her face set with the same quiet determination Boone had come to recognize in her. "I'm ready," she said, her voice calm. Boone felt a flicker of something inside him. He wasn't sure if it was gratitude or something else, but he knew one thing: he couldn't do this without her. And maybe, just maybe, that was what scared him the most. They spent the rest of the day preparing, gathering what they needed, packing up the small cabin, and making sure everything was ready. Boone wasn't sure where they would go next. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew they couldn't stay here, not after what had happened. As they rode out, Boone took one last look at the cabin. It had been a brief refuge, a small piece of peace in a world that didn't offer much. But it was time to leave it behind, time to keep moving to outrun the past. Boone didn't look back as they rode into the unknown, but Lily, sitting behind, him on his horse, had her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her face a mask of determination, and for the first time in a long time, Boone wondered if maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The ride through the early morning fog was silent, the only sound the rhythmic thud of hooves against the earth and the occasional creak of saddles. Boone and Lily were both too preoccupied with their thoughts to speak, their minds heavy with what had just transpired and then what lay ahead. The sky above them was overcast, the sun hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and the air was thick with a kind of tension, like the calm before a storm. Boone had ridden through many storms in his life, literal and metaphorical, but something about this one felt different. His hand instinctively gripped the reins a little tighter as he pushed his horse forward, the long stretch of open land ahead feeling like an uncertain future. Lily rode beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon, alert and vigilant. She was still, but there was a quiet determination in her that Boone couldn't ignore. She had shown him strength in ways he hadn't expected, but now, as they journeyed further from the only home they'd known in recent days, he could feel her presence more than ever. She wasn't just here with him, she was a part of this, a part of him, and he couldn't let her go. The wind whipped through their hair, and for a moment Boone allowed himself to think about the past. He'd spent so many years running, hiding, fighting for his survival, that he hadn't stopped to think about what it all meant, what it would cost him in the end. And now, as the days grew longer and the shadows of his former life began to close in, he couldn't help but wonder, was this life worth living? Was there still a chance for redemption? He glanced at Lily, her face set in a mask of focus, and for the first time he realized that maybe he didn't have all the answers. Maybe he didn't need to. As long as she was with him, as long as they had each other, he could face whatever was coming. The land stretched out before them, wild and untamed, but the sense of freedom it once gave him now felt suffocating. They couldn't stay on the road forever. Boone knew that. He needed a plan. But the question was Where could they go? And who else would come looking for him? He had left too many enemies in his wake, and none of them would forget what he'd done. "We can't keep running," Boone said, his voice cutting through the quiet. Lily didn't look at him, but he could feel her turn her head toward him, the weight of her gaze sharp. "Where do we go then?" Boone shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I don't know, but I know we can't stay out here in the open. It's too dangerous." Lily's eyes remained on the road ahead as she spoke, her tone steady. "We could head north. There's a town up there. I've heard rumors of it, a place where no one asks questions, a place where people can disappear." Boone turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. He hadn't known her long, but he'd learned that there was more to her than the quiet exterior she presented. She wasn't afraid of what was out there. But Boone knew the world didn't work that way. It didn't offer second chances. "I've been on the run long enough to know that towns like that are dangerous," Boone said quietly. "They may offer refuge, but there's always a price. People like us don't just vanish. They get hunted." Lily glanced at him then, her eyes meeting his for the first time in hours. There was no fear in her expression, just a quiet resolve. "I'm not running any more, Boone. I'm not hiding, not from my past, not from anything." Boone's heart thudded in his chest at her words. He wasn't sure if it was admiration or something more. The truth was, he didn't know what he was feeling anymore. He didn't know if he was afraid of what was to come or if he was relieved. He'd been alone for so long, but now, with Lily by his side, everything felt different. He nodded slowly, his voice rough as he spoke. "I'm not hiding either." By midday they found themselves at the edge of the forest, where the trees grew thick and dense, blocking the light. Boone slowed his horse, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. He had been on the road long enough to know when something was off. Lily followed his lead, her hand resting near the rifle at her side. She had become proficient with it in the short time they'd spent together, but Boone could tell that the tension in the air wasn't just about the road ahead. There was something else, something that had shifted between them in the past few days. They moved quietly, cautiously, through the trees, keeping their horses close. Boone's senses were on high alert, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them. The wind rustled through the leaves, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Boone's hand instinctively reached for the rifle at his back. "Stay close," he muttered to Lily, his voice low and cautious. She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. Boone could feel her presence beside him, steady and unyielding. They were in this together, whether he wanted it or not. The woods were dense, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. Boone led them through the trees, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he felt the presence of someone nearby, but he couldn't pinpoint where they were. They moved slowly, keeping to the cover of the trees. Boone's hand remained on the rifle, ready for anything. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. Then the sound of a twig snapping broke the quiet. Boone's heart leapt in his chest as he spun around, his rifle coming up in an instant. His eyes locked onto a figure standing in the clearing ahead, barely visible through the trees. A man. Tall, rugged, with a weathered face that Boone instantly recognized. "Wes," Boone said, his voice tight with surprise. The man didn't speak, but he stepped forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his side. Boone could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He hadn't seen Wes in years. He hadn't expected to see him again. "Boone," Wes said, his voice low and gruff, "it's been a long time." Lily moved closer to Boone, her overwhelmed eyes wary as she took in the stranger. Boone didn't need to explain who Wes was. He knew the man's reputation, and it wasn't one to be proud of. Wes was a former bounty hunter, one of the few people Boone knew who could track a man like a bloodhound. "What do you want?" Boone asked, his tone cold, his rifle still raised. Wes didn't flinch. "I've been sent to bring you in. It's time to face what you've been running from." Boone's heart skipped a beat. He knew this day would come. He had known it for years. But now, standing face to face with Wes, it felt real. Too real. "I'm not going anywhere," Boone said, firmly, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Not today." Wes' eyes darkened, his hand tightening around the pistol. "You don't get to make that decision, Boone." Lily stepped forward then, her voice sharp. "If you think we're just going to walk away and let you take him, you've got another thing coming." Boone shot her a glance, but Lily didn't. Back down. She was standing beside him, ready for whatever came next. And in that moment, Boone realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about both of them. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Boone stood with his rifle trained on Wes, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of his breath, shallow and controlled, seemed too loud in the oppressive silence of the forest. Lily stood beside him, her hand steady on her rifle, though Boone could sense her own unease. Wes, a man who Boone once considered an ally, was now an obstacle, an unwelcome reminder of the world Boone had tried so desperately to leave behind. The weight of the past, of everything he had done, hung heavy between them. Wes wasn't here for a friendly reunion. He was here to finish something Boone had started, but never finished. "I told you, Wes," Boone said, his voice low and controlled. "I'm not going back." Wes didn't flinch. His hand rested on the hilt of his revolver, his eyes locked onto Boone with a sharp intensity. "You think you have a choice in this?" Wes asked, his voice gruff but calm. "You're marked." "Boone, it's over. Time to pay for what you've done." Boone's jaw tightened, his grip on the rifle tightening as well. He'd heard this before. The same words, the same threats, all part of the same dance. He wasn't going back to that life. Not after everything he'd worked for. Not after finding something worth protecting. "I'm done with that life," Boone said firmly. "I'm not running anymore, and neither is she." He glanced at Lily, who was standing tall, a fire in her eyes that Boone hadn't seen before. She wasn't just a passenger in this journey. She was as much a part of it as he was, and the idea of losing her, of going back to the darkness alone, made his stomach turn. "You can't just make your past disappear, Boone," Wes said, taking a slow step forward, his boots crunching on the forest floor. "No matter how far you run, no matter how many people you try to protect, it's always going to catch up with you." Boone's finger hovered near the trigger, but he didn't pull it. He couldn't. Not yet. He knew Wes, knew the man well, enough to understand that he wasn't just here for a fight. There was something else behind his eyes. Something personal. "You always did have a way with words, Wes," Boone said, his voice edged with bitterness. "But this time, you're not getting what you want." Wes chuckled darkly, his lips curling into a grin. "What I want? Hell. Boone, you think I'm here for you?" "I'm not here for you. I'm here because your past is still breathing, and it's not done with you yet." Boone's heart skipped a beat. He didn't like the sound of that. He didn't like the look in Wes's eyes. Something had changed. The situation had escalated beyond what Boone had prepared for. "I'm not going anywhere," Boone repeated, his voice steady. He shifted his stance, positioning himself between Wes and Lily. His focus was razor-sharp now, his instincts screaming at him to prepare for what was coming. Wes's grin faltered slightly, his hand still resting on his revolver. "You don't have a say in this anymore. You think you're safe here, out in the middle of nowhere? You think the men you've crossed are going to just let you ride off into the sunset? You're a fool if you think that." Boone didn't reply. He didn't need to. He could feel the truth of Wes's words, but he wasn't about to let fear rule him, not now, not when he had Lily with him. He wouldn't let her become another casualty in a war he'd long since walked away from. Lily shifted slightly, her rifle still in her grip, her stance resolute. "We're not going back," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "Not for anyone. Not for you." Wes's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment a flicker of something passed over his face. Surprise, maybe, or something else. But it was gone in an instant. He refocused on Boone, his expression hardening. "You think this is just about you?" Wes asked, his voice taking on a darker tone. "You think you're the only one with blood on your hands? You're not the only one with a price on your head. You've got no idea who's coming after you, Boone. No idea how much blood is owed." The weight of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and for the first time, Boone felt a flicker of doubt creep into his thoughts. His past had never been far behind him, but the idea that someone else was pulling strings, setting things into motion, set his nerves on edge. "Who else?" Boone demanded, his voice barely above a growl. "Who else is after me?" Wes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Lily, his eyes narrowing as if assessing the threat she posed. "You think this is just about some old grudge?" he said, his tone laced with cynicism. "You're playing a dangerous game, Boone. You've crossed people. Who don't forget, they don't forgive." Lily stepped forward then, her eyes fierce and unwavering. "We've got no intention of running, Wes, no intention of hiding." "You can tell your employers that?" Wes snorted. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? You think that standing here and talking big is going to change anything. You're playing at something you don't understand." Boone couldn't hold it back any longer. He stepped closer, his rifle raised, the tension in his body palpable. "Enough talking. We're not going anywhere." For a long moment, Wes just stood there, his gaze locked on Boone. He seemed to be weighing his options, sizing up the situation. Then, without a word, he took a step back, his hand leaving his revolver. Boone's finger twitched, but he didn't pull the trigger. Wes's eyes flicked toward the forest, then back to Boone. "You think this is over? That I'm just going to walk away?" Boone didn't respond. He didn't need to. Wes had said everything that needed to be said. The past was chasing him, and he couldn't outrun it. Not anymore. But for the first time, Boone felt something in him shift, a resolve that had been buried deep inside for years. He wasn't just running. He wasn't just trying to survive. He was fighting back, and whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. Wes's eyes hardened, his jaw set with determination. "I'm not leaving without you, Boone, but I'm not stupid either. I'll give you this one chance." Boone didn't lower his rifle. "You don't get to make the rules." Wes's expression darkened. "Then it's your funeral." He turned, without another word, and walked into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Boone stood still, his breath coming in short bursts, his body tense with the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Lily stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "What now?" Boone turned to face her, his eyes hard, but there was a flicker of something else in them. Determination, fear, and a quiet strength that had grown in him since he'd first laid eyes on her. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let anyone take her from him. Not now. Not ever. "We keep moving," Boone said, his voice steady, his grip on the rifle firm. "We keep moving until we're out of this mess." Lily nodded, her face set with the same determination that mirrored his own. The road ahead was uncertain, but they were in it together, and that was enough. The days following Wes's sudden departure were eerily quiet, but Boone knew better than to trust the calm. The shadows of the past were closing in faster than he could outrun them, and every step they took only seemed to bring them closer to the inevitable. It wasn't just Wes that Boone had to worry about. It was everyone who had ever known his name, everyone whose lives he had touched and ruined. He didn't want to drag Lily further into his mess, but the truth was, she was already in it. There was no turning back now. She was in his world whether she liked it or not, and Boone couldn't protect her from that, not forever. They kept moving, riding further north toward the rumored town Lily had mentioned, a place where people went to disappear. The town was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where no one asked questions and no one cared about your past. It sounded too good to be true, but Boone was willing to take a chance. What choice did he have? Every night they set up camp on the outskirts of a small clearing, the dark trees surrounding them like silent sentinels. Boone kept watch, his rifle always within arm's reach, his mind constantly shifting between the present and the ghosts of his past. There was always a sense of urgency in his movements, a feeling that someone or something was hunting them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Lily, though quieter than usual, had adapted to life on the move. She handled her rifle with more confidence, her eyes sharper, always alert. She was stronger than Boone had expected, but the strain of their journey was beginning to show. He could see it in the way her shoulders slumped slightly when she thought. He wasn't watching, the way her eyes lost some of their fire when they camped for the night. Boone couldn't blame her. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to living on the run, constantly looking over her shoulder, always wondering when the next danger would find them. He couldn't promise her safety. He couldn't promise her a peaceful life. All he could do was keep moving forward, keep fighting, and hope that somehow it would be enough. It was late afternoon when the first sign of trouble came. They had been riding through dense woods for hours, the trail narrow and winding, the trees thick. Overhead, the forest felt more oppressive than usual, the silence of the trees almost suffocating. Boone slowed his horse, scanning the area ahead. He didn't know why, but something about the woods felt different today. Lily, sensing the change in his posture, leaned forward in her saddle, her eyes narrowing as she followed his gaze. "What is it?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Boone didn't answer right away. He was listening for anything that might give away their position. But there was nothing. No sound of birds or animals, no wind rustling the leaves. It was too quiet. A faint rustling noise broke the stillness, and Boone's eyes snapped to the right. His heart raced as he saw the flicker of movement through the trees, a shadow, barely visible against the dark trunks. Boone's instincts screamed at him, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. "Get down!" he hissed to Lily, already slipping off his horse and crouching low to the ground. Lily followed suit, her eyes wide with sudden fear. "What is it?" Boone didn't answer. He was too focused on the trees ahead, watching the faint movements as they grew closer. He could hear the faint crunch of boots on leaves, the unmistakable sound of someone, or someone's, moving through the forest. Lily's hand was on her rifle, her fingers tightening on the trigger. "How many?" she whispered. Boone didn't know, but he had a sinking feeling that they were about to find out. "Stay low," Boone whispered, signaling for her to move closer to the cover of a large rock just ahead. His fingers brushed the rifle on his back, his mind already calculating their best chance for escape. The rustling grew louder, and Boone's heart sank as he saw movement. Two figures emerged from the trees, men on horseback. Boone couldn't see their faces from this distance, but he could tell they weren't friendly. The way they rode with purpose, the way they scanned the woods as if searching for something, made it clear they weren't out here for a leisurely ride. Lily held her breath, her eyes fixed on Boone. Boone didn't know who these men were, but he knew one thing for certain: they weren't here to let them go. "They've got us," Boone muttered under his breath. The men on horseback were still too far away to engage, but the tension was thick enough to choke on. Boone's fingers wrapped around his rifle, his thumb brushing over the trigger. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but the situation was rapidly slipping out of control. "We can't outrun them on horseback," Lily whispered, her voice tight. "We need to fight." Boone hesitated. He had spent so many years running, so many years avoiding confrontation, that it took him a moment to accept what Lily was suggesting. But she was right. They couldn't keep running, not anymore. "We fight," Boone said, his voice low but firm. "We fight to survive." First shot rang out before Boone could even raise his rifle. One of the riders had seen them and fired from his saddle, the bullet narrowly missing Boone's shoulder as he ducked behind the rock. He didn't waste time. He raised his rifle and fired back, his shot striking the rider in the chest. The man fell from his horse, crashing into the ground with a sickening thud. The second rider pulled his horse around in a tight circle, aiming his rifle directly at Boone. Lily reacted first. She fired, her shot striking the rider in the leg. The man screamed in pain, but he didn't go down. Instead, he spurred his horse forward, charging at them with a fury Boone had seen in too many men before. Boone fired again, this time hitting the rider square in the chest. The man collapsed backward, his horse rearing up and throwing him to the ground. For a moment, there was silence. The sounds of the forest returned, birds calling in the distance, the wind rustling through the leaves. But Boone wasn't fooled. He knew this wasn't over. There would be more. There would always be more. Lily stepped forward, her rifle still at the ready. Boone turned to her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of fear. But there was none, just determination. She was in this with him. She was fighting for their survival just as much as he was. "Are you okay?" Boone asked, his voice gruff. Lily nodded, her expression hard. "We need to keep moving." Boone didn't argue. There was no time for that. They had to get out of the woods. They had to get to the town. And they had to do it before the next group of riders showed up. As they rode away, Boone kept his eyes on the trees, the distant rumble of hooves behind them serving as a reminder that their fight was far from over. He didn't know what the future held, whether they'd make it to the town, whether they'd survive the next wave of enemies, or whether the past would catch up with them once again. But for the first time in a long time, Boone felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the narrow path ahead. The air had grown warmer as they rode through the thick woods, but the sense of urgency that clung to Boone and Lily made it feel like the world around them was moving, too slowly. They had barely stopped to rest since the confrontation in the forest. Boone could feel the ache in his muscles, the exhaustion in his bones. But there was no time for that. They were being hunted. And that knowledge gnawed at him, relentless and suffocating. They were making their way toward the town Lily had mentioned, the one where people supposedly disappeared, where the past didn't follow you. Boone had his doubts, but right now, it was the only place that offered any hope of safety, if it was even real. He didn't know who was behind the men who had attacked them, or who was pulling the strings on this wild chase. But he knew one thing for certain. The closer they got to the town, the more dangerous things would become. They were not the only ones looking for refuge. Lily was quiet beside him, her gaze constantly scanning the landscape. She hadn't spoken much since their encounter with the riders. Boone could sense that she was processing everything, just as he was. It wasn't just the violence they had faced, the blood they had spilled, it was the weight of what was coming. They were both running out of time, and the cost of staying on the move would only continue to rise. The thought of running away, of hiding from their past forever, tugged at Boone's mind. He'd spent years doing just that, and each time it had seemed like a temporary reprieve, but now it felt like a different kind of battle. A battle not just for survival, but for something more. The thought of Lily beside him, standing tall and unwavering, made Boone realize that he wasn't just running for himself anymore. He was running for them both. They rode through the dense trees, the trail ahead growing narrower. The horses' hooves left deep impressions in the soft dirt, but Boone knew it wouldn't take long for someone to follow their trail. It was just a matter of time. The question was, how much time did they have before they were found? By the time the sun had dipped behind the horizon, Boone and Lily were both exhausted. They had stopped for a brief rest earlier in the day, but it wasn't enough. Boone could see the fatigue on Lily's face, the way her shoulders slumped slightly as she urged her horse forward. She wasn't used to this life, and he could see the toll it was taking on her. He didn't want to admit it, but it was taking a toll on him too. The constant vigilance, the endless travel, the fear of being caught, it was wearing them both thin. Boone had spent years living in the shadows, fighting for every scrap of peace he could find, but now, with Lily by his side, he realized how much he had taken for granted. The quiet moments, the rare moments of calm. "I think we should stop here for the night," Boone said, his voice rough from the strain of the ride. Lily glanced at him, her face pale from exhaustion, but her eyes still sharp. "You think we're safe here?" she asked, her voice low. Boone scanned the area, his instincts prickling with the knowledge that they weren't safe anywhere. But he also knew they couldn't keep riding through the night. The horses needed rest, and they needed to regain their strength. They'd be easier to track if they kept pushing themselves, and that wasn't an option. "We can't keep running like this," Boone said, his voice softer now. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. "We need to rest, but we'll keep watch." Lily nodded, though the weariness in her eyes was unmistakable. She was as tired as he was, but she didn't show it. She hadn't shown any sign of weakness since they started this journey together, and Boone had come to rely on that. They dismounted and set up camp quickly, Boone keeping his rifle close as Lily tended to the fire. The crackling of the flames was the only sound between them as they worked in silence. Boone didn't mind the quiet. It was easier than trying to find the words for everything that had passed between them. He set up their bedrolls, then sat down, a little ways from the fire, his rifle across his lap. The weight of the weapon felt familiar, but it didn't bring him comfort. Not anymore. It was just a tool, another necessary part of the survival game he'd been playing for too long. Lily sat beside the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering light. Her eyes were distant, as if she was lost in her thoughts. Boone wasn't sure what she was thinking, but he could guess. She had always been good at hiding her emotions, but Boone had learned to read the small signs, the way she shifted her seat, the way her fingers twitched when she thought no one was watching. She was just as exhausted as he was, but unlike him, she didn't show it. "You've been quiet," Boone said, his voice breaking the silence. "Something on your mind?" Lily looked at him, her gaze steady. "I'm just thinking," she said softly, "about everything." Boone nodded, but he didn't push her for details. He knew she was processing the same things he was. They had both changed in these last few days, and not all of it was for the better. The violence, the fear, the uncertainty, it had a way of chipping away at a person's soul. Boone had seen it happen to too many men and women in his past, and he could feel it happening to him. After a few moments, Lily spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. "Do you ever regret it? The life you've lived?" Boone's chest tightened at the question, but he didn't look away. "I don't have time for regrets," he said gruffly. "I've made my choices. Now I just have to live with them." Lily nodded slowly, as if she understood. "I used to think I had more time," she said, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Time to figure things out, time to fix things." Boone's eyes softened as he looked at her. She wasn't just talking about her past, she was talking about the future, about what came next. "You've done what you could," he said quietly. "You're still here, still fighting." Lily met his gaze then, her eyes dark and filled with something Boone couldn't quite read. "I don't know if I'm fighting anymore, Boone," she said. "I think I'm just waiting." Boone didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He understood what she meant. The road ahead was a mystery, and neither of them knew how it would end. They could keep running, keep hiding, but eventually the past would catch up with them. They couldn't outrun it forever. "I'm not running anymore," Lily said suddenly, her voice firm, her shoulders squared as if she had made a decision. "I'm here. I'm with you. We'll face whatever comes together." Boone's heart gave a strange lurch in his chest at her words. He hadn't expected her to say that, hadn't expected her to stand beside him after everything that had happened. But she had. And for the first time in a long time, Boone allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The night passed uneventfully, the crackling fire and the distant sounds of the woods lulling them both into a restless sleep. But Boone didn't sleep for long. His mind was always running, always alert. He woke at every sound, every shift of the wind. The past was still chasing them, and Boone knew it wouldn't stop. Not until it had caught up with him, but for now he had Lily, and that at least was enough. The room was small, its walls grimy, and the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The only light came from a dim lamp in the corner, casting a faint yellow glow over the sparse furnishings. A bed with faded sheets, a rickety wooden chair, and a small table that looked as though it might collapse if you so much as leaned on it. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now. Boone and Lily sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind outside, pressing against the shutters. They had unpacked quickly, setting their things down in the corner, but neither of them seemed eager to settle. Boone couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though he hadn't seen anyone directly follow them after they entered the inn. But here, in this place, in this town, Boone felt like a storm was gathering just out of sight. He leaned against the table, his rifle resting on his knee, the weight of it familiar but comforting. His thoughts were heavy with the sense that this was only a temporary respite. It had been days since the confrontation with Wes, and though they had made it here, Boone knew that every day they spent in Elysium Hollow brought them closer to danger. His past was still alive, breathing down his neck, a shadow that wouldn't let him rest. Lily was sitting on the edge of the bed, her elbows on her knees, staring down at the floor. Boone had been watching her, his gaze flicking between her and the door. She had been quiet since they'd arrived. Too quiet. He could feel the weight of her silence pressing down on him, and he wondered if she was thinking about the same things he was. "We're not safe here, are we?" Lily's voice broke the stillness, her words soft, but cutting through the air with an unexpected sharpness. Boone didn't need to ask what she meant. He already knew. He could feel the same unease building inside him, like a storm about to break. He took a breath, steadying himself before answering. "No," he said, his voice low and heavy. "We're not, but we don't have much choice. Not anymore." Lily turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. Her eyes, usually full of fire, now held a quiet sadness. "How long do we stay here, Boone? How long do we keep running?" Boone didn't have an answer. He wanted to tell her that they could find a way to escape, that they could disappear and leave the past behind them. But he knew that was a lie. There was no running from what he had done. There was no escaping the blood on his hands. And worse yet, he was dragging her down this road with him. "The past doesn't let you go, Lily," Boone said, his voice tight, with something he couldn't fully explain. "No matter how far you run, no matter how many towns you hide in, it catches up with you eventually." Lily stood up slowly, walking toward the small window that overlooked the dusty street outside. She stood there for a long time, her back to him. "So what do we do now? Just wait for it to find us?" Boone pushed himself up from the chair, crossing the room to stand beside her. He glanced out the window, too, though all he could see were the shadowy outlines of a few buildings. There were no signs of immediate danger, no men on horseback, riding through the street. But Boone knew that could change at any moment. He knew better than to think they were safe just because the streets were quiet. "No," Boone said finally, his voice steady. "We don't wait. We make a plan. We figure out how to get out of this." Lily turned to face him then, her eyes searching his face as though trying to read him. "And what's the plan, Boone? Because I don't see one." Boone didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. He was still thinking, still calculating, his mind moving through possibilities. But the truth was, he didn't have a plan, not yet. All he knew was that they couldn't stay in Elysium Hollow forever. This place, with its deadened streets and hollow-eyed people, didn't offer peace. It only offered more time to run. "We find the right people," Boone said slowly. "The ones who can help us. People who know how to get out of here without drawing attention." Lily raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "And who are these people?" Boone didn't have an answer. He was searching for one, but the truth was, he didn't know who he could trust in this town. Elysium Hollow had its secrets, and Boone could feel them crawling beneath the surface like a thick, sticky fog. If they were going to survive here, they'd need allies. but Boone wasn't sure where to find them, or even if he could. As evening fell, the town seemed to come alive in a way that was both unnerving and familiar. The saloons, most of them tucked away down side streets, began to open their doors, and the first signs of movement outside the inn became more noticeable. Figures moved in and out of the shadows, their faces hidden beneath hats and cloaks. Boone could feel the eyes of the town on them, even in the relative safety of the inn. This place wasn't as quiet as it seemed. It was only waiting for something. Lily was still restless, her mind clearly working through everything they had just discussed. Boone could see the way her fingers twitched every so often, her eyes darting toward the door like she was expecting someone, to come bursting through it at any moment. He didn't blame her. He was doing the same thing. Boone needed information. They both needed to know more about this place and its people if they were going to make it out in one piece. If they didn't find a way out soon, they'd be swallowed, whole by the darkness closing in. He knew exactly where to go. The saloon was dimly lit, the low murmur of conversation almost drowned out by the sound of clinking glasses and the soft shuffle of boots on the floor. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco smoke and spilled whiskey, and as Boone and Lily entered, the noise seemed to drop just slightly. A few heads turned, but no one said anything. No one was stupid enough to ask questions. Boone's eyes scanned the room, his gaze quickly landing on the bartender. The man was older, grizzled, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. Boone knew the look. This was the kind of man who knew how to keep secrets. He walked up to the bar, Lily at his side. The bartender didn't acknowledge them, at first continuing to wipe down the counter with a rag. "You got a name, friend?" Boone asked quietly, his voice low enough that only the bartender could hear. The bartender paused, finally meeting Boone's eyes. He said nothing at first, but Boone could see the gears turning in his head. He was sizing Boone up, wondering whether he should trust him or not. "Got a name," the bartender finally muttered, "but it ain't worth much here." Boone didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need information about the town, about who runs things around here." The bartender's eyes flicked to Lily and back to Boone. He took a slow breath before answering. "Information ain't free," the bartender said, his voice rough and low. "But you already knew that." Boone didn't flinch. He knew the price. "What's it going to cost me?" The bartender looked around the room, his gaze lingering on a few of the patrons sitting in the corners. He leaned in closer, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Anything that happens here stays here," the bartender said. "If you're looking to disappear, you better talk to Reuben. He's the one who gets people out. But be careful. He's got his own rules, and those rules aren't the kind you want to break." Boone nodded slowly, his mind already racing through possibilities. Reuben. The name had the ring of someone who knew how to move people without leaving a trace, but Boone also knew that if Reuben could help them, he would be dangerous. This wasn't a game of survival anymore. This was about crossing into a world that even Boone wasn't sure he could survive. The weight of the decision hung heavy over Boone like a storm cloud, dark and oppressive. He could feel it in his bones. This was it. The moment where everything he had fought for, everything he had tried to leave behind, would come crashing down. He had crossed a line the moment he set foot in Elysium Hollow, but now the stakes were higher than ever. Boone and Lily sat in the dimly lit corner of the saloon, their drinks untouched on the table, their eyes fixed on the door that had just swung open. Reuben had arrived. The man they had heard so much about, the one who had the answer they were desperately seeking. Boone's heart beat a little faster as he watched Reuben cross the room, his gait slow, deliberate, like a man who owned the place. Reuben was tall, with a broad, muscular frame that seemed out of place in this rundown town. His face was scarred, a testament to years of hard living, and his eyes were dark, calculating. Boone could sense the danger in him, the kind of man who never spoke unless it was necessary, the kind who watched, waited, and then struck when it suited him. He didn't look at Boone or Lily as he moved past them, his focus on something or someone else in the back of the room. Boone watched him, sizing him up, trying to gauge whether or not Reuben was someone they could trust. He wasn't sure why he was giving Reuben a chance. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the faint glimmer of hope that Elysium Hollow offered. A place to disappear, to start over. But Boone knew the truth. They weren't here for redemption. They were here because they had no other choice. Reuben finally stopped at the bar, where the bartender nodded in acknowledgement, and they exchanged a few words Boone couldn't hear. After a moment, Reuben turned and walked toward them, his eyes locking onto Boone with a quiet intensity. "You're Boone Lane, aren't you?" Reuben asked, his voice deep but soft. No surprise, just a simple fact. Boone didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure how to answer. They were supposed to be running, staying off the radar, but Reuben had already figured him out. He wasn't the first, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. "I am," Boone said finally, his voice steady. Reuben nodded, as though he had already expected that answer. "You're looking for a way out of this place, I take it?" Boone nodded in return, though his eyes didn't leave Reuben's face. "You know how to help?" Reuben's lips curled into a half-smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He motioned for them to follow him and led them to the back of the saloon, a narrow hallway that opened into a small, dimly lit room. A few men sat at a table in the corner, their heads bent in quiet conversation. They didn't acknowledge Boone and Lily as they entered, but their eyes followed them, watching every movement. Reuben closed the door behind them and gestured for them to sit. "I can get you out," he said, his voice low, almost too quiet. "But nothing comes free. You should know that." Boone sat down, his gaze hard. "What's the price?" Reuben took his time, leaning back against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. He seemed to be considering Boone's question, as if weighing the cost of what he was about to say. "The price is simple," Reuben said finally. "You do something for me, and I'll make sure you get out, alive, and without anyone knowing where you went." Lily shifted in her seat, her hand subconsciously resting on her rifle. But she didn't say anything. Boone could feel the weight of her silence beside him. They had both known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. "What's the job?" Boone asked, his voice steady, though the adrenaline was already kicking in. He was preparing for whatever Reuben might throw at them. Reuben looked at him, his eyes calculating. "I have a few contacts, people who don't ask questions. I need you to do something for them. In return, I'll make sure you're not followed. You'll be able to leave this town without anyone knowing where you're going." Boone's mind raced. He had no love for people like Reuben, men who dealt in the shadows, people who took and never gave without a price. But the offer was too tempting. He had to take it, for Lily's sake, if nothing else. "I'll do it," Boone said, his voice firm. Reuben nodded slowly. "You'll be expected to deliver. And I'm not talking about some simple job. This is big, and it will cost you. So don't waste my time if you're not in this for the long haul." Lily's eyes flicked to Boone's face, and for a brief moment, Boone saw the hesitation there. She didn't want to get involved in whatever deal Reuben was offering. Boone could see that much. But she knew, just as he did, that they didn't have the luxury of turning away from opportunities anymore. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Boone asked, his voice calm, but his insides were tight with the uncertainty of it all. Reuben straightened, his eyes never leaving Boone's face. "There's a shipment coming through the town. You're going to help take it." Boone's brows furrowed. "A shipment? What kind of shipment?" Reuben didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward, his gaze intense. "It's not the kind of shipment most people know about. Guns, ammo, things that can change the power balance in this town." Boone's pulse quickened at the mention of weapons. He didn't want to get involved in another violent scheme, but he had no choice. This was the price they had to pay to get out. He knew that much. "How do I fit into this?" Boone asked, his voice low. "You and your friend," Reuben said, glancing at Lily, "are going to make sure it gets through without any interruptions. There are people who would love to get their hands on this shipment, and I don't want them getting anywhere near it." Boone's stomach churned. He knew exactly what kind of people Reuben was dealing with, And it wasn't pretty, but this was their only option. They had no choice but to follow through. If they didn't, they'd be trapped in Elysium Hollow forever. Hunted like animals. "You get the shipment through safely," Reuben said, "and I'll make sure you're out of here." Free and clear. Boone didn't say anything. He just nodded, accepting the deal. It wasn't what he wanted. It wasn't the life he had hoped for. But it was the only way forward. Reuben turned and walked to the door. But before he left, he turned back to Boone and Lily. "I'll be in touch. Don't take too long." And with that, he left the room, leaving them alone with the weight of the deal hanging between them. Lily was silent as they walked back to their room. Boone could feel the weight of her gaze, but he didn't look at her. He couldn't. He was already too deep into this to turn back now. "What now?" Lily asked, her voice calm but sharp, cutting through the tension. Boone took a deep breath. "Now we do what we have to do. We get the shipment through, and we get out of here." Lily didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both knew what needed to be done. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Boone felt the strange pull of hope. They were still alive. They still had a chance, and that was enough. The night settled in thick and heavy over Elysium Hollow, the moon hidden behind a blanket of clouds, and the quiet hum of the town felt like a false lullaby. Inside the small room that Boone and Lily had claimed as their temporary shelter, the weight of the plan hung between them like a dark cloud. Boone had agreed to Reuben's terms, but as the hours passed, the decision sat uneasily in his gut. Lily hadn't said much since their conversation with Reuben. She was more withdrawn now, her mind clearly at work on their next move. Boone didn't blame her. He wasn't sure how to process the deal either. It wasn't just a simple favor. They were about to get involved with people who could easily drag them into a world darker than anything they had faced so far. "We need to talk." Lily's voice finally broke the silence. Boone looked up from the map he had spread out on the table, studying the route they were supposed to take to get to the shipment's drop point. The plan was simple on the surface. Pick up the cargo, make sure it got to Reuben's contact, and keep a low profile. But Boone knew it was never that easy. There were too many unknowns. Lily stood near the window, her hand resting lightly on the sill as she looked out into the street below. She didn't seem to be watching anything in particular, just lost in thought. "What's on your mind?" Boone asked, his voice low, careful. Lily turned to face him, her eyes hard but clear. "You know this isn't just about the shipment, right? We're not just smuggling guns through this town. We're walking into something we can't get out of." Boone stood and walked toward her, his boots heavy on the worn wooden floor. He could feel the tension rising in his chest, but he didn't know how to explain what he was feeling. He had known from the moment they set foot in this place that there would be no easy way out. "I know," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I didn't have a choice, Lily. We don't have a choice." "I get it," Lily replied, her voice steady, but with a trace of frustration. "But I'm not here to just follow your lead, Boone. I'm here to survive too, and that means thinking for myself." Boone's eyes softened slightly, his gaze flickering to the door as though expecting someone to burst in. But the only thing that greeted them was the stillness of the room, broken only by their shared silence. "I never meant to drag you into this," Boone said after a long pause. I can't let them take you. I can't let them hurt you, Lily." Her expression softened, but only for a moment. "You can't protect me from everything, Boone, and neither can I protect you." The words stung, but Boone wasn't angry. She was right. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The world they were in now wasn't the same as the one they had started in. It was a place where survival came at a price, and the price wasn't always measured in dollars or goods. Boone finally stepped forward, standing next to her at the window, looking out over the silent town. "We do this tonight. We get the shipment through, and we keep moving. We leave Elysium Hollow behind." Lily nodded, but there was something else in her eyes. Doubt, maybe, or suspicion. Boone wasn't sure, but the feeling that the walls were closing in on them, that they were being watched, had only grown stronger since they arrived in town. "I just don't trust Reuben," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something about him?" "I don't know." Boone clenched his jaw, turning to look at her. "I don't trust him either, but we don't have the luxury of choice." Lily met his gaze, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge how much of the truth he was holding back. "How do we know he's not setting us up? How do we know this whole thing isn't a trap?" Boone swallowed hard, his mind racing through the possible outcomes. He hadn't liked Reuben from the moment he laid eyes on him, but the man had made a promise. And Boone had to trust that promise, if only for their sake. "I don't know," Boone admitted, the weight of the truth settling like a stone in his stomach. "But we don't have time to wait for the perfect plan. We take the shipment, we get through tonight, and then we leave." Lily didn't argue, but her face remained hard, the quiet tension between them palpable. It was clear she was just as unsettled by the situation as Boone. They were both caught in a web they couldn't untangle, and with every step, it seemed like the strands were growing tighter. That night they rode out to the agreed-upon meeting point. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the town in a cloak of darkness, broken only by the distant flicker of lanterns from the saloons. They moved quickly, their horses' hooves muffled on the soft dirt, as they made their way to the Hui alley behind the saloon, the place where Reuben had instructed them to meet. Boone's nerves were on edge as they approached. He could feel the weight of the rifles on his back, the familiar tension of anticipation and fear. They had been warned by Reuben that the shipment was to be picked up with no questions asked. But Boone knew better than to trust anyone who said that. No one ever made a deal like this without wanting something in return. They reached the alley, their horses slowing to a stop as they saw the silhouette of a man waiting in the shadows. Reuben stepped forward from the dark, his tall form a stark contrast against the night. "You're late," Reuben's voice cut through the silence, his tone more harsh than usual. "We had to be sure," Boone replied, his voice steady despite. The unease curling in his stomach, Reuben didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned and motioned for them to follow him deeper into the alley. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and Boone's instincts screamed at him to turn around and leave, but he didn't. Reuben stopped at the back door of a warehouse, unlocking it with a key and pushing it open slowly. Inside, several men were standing by crates and barrels, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. "This is it," Reuben said. "Get the crates loaded. We don't have much time." Boone's heart pounded as he moved toward the crates, his eyes scanning the shadows. Something didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and he could sense Lily's unease next to him. As they moved to the crates, a loud crash suddenly echoed from the back of the warehouse, followed by the sound of boots hitting the floor. Boone whirled around, his hand reaching for his rifle. "Ambush," he muttered. The door to the warehouse slammed shut behind them, and men from all sides began to emerge from the shadows, weapons drawn. Lily reacted first, her rifle coming up with lightning speed, but Boone knew this was it. They were trapped.